Well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming along to the Natural Hazard Research Australia Knowledge Sharing Forum. Today's one is all about shared responsibility for bushfire management. Now, this project, well, the people presenting are also part of the wider project by David Bowman from the University of Tasmania, looking at bushfire risk at the rural-urban interface. My name is Rowena Morris. I'm the New South Wales ACT Node Research Manager, and I have the pleasure of working on this project. I also had the pleasure of working on our PhDs a long time ago, Philippa and myself, and it's lovely to have her here today, particularly with her legal knowledge for this project. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Durrable country, the Yuin people down here, different nations. We need to acknowledge that we're meeting across countries all around Australia today. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to reflect on the importance of Indigenous nations knowledge and the capability that we can share in the natural hazard research and the learnings that can be made. I'd like to introduce you to our two wonderful speakers. We have Anna Goodrum from the University of Tasmania, and Associate Professor now, Philippa McCormick from Adelaide Uni, and she's also part of University of Tasmania. Now, Anna is a postdoc research fellow at the Fire Centre, University of Tasmania. She specialises in social resilience and community adaptation to wildfire. Her research explores how people live with fire risk, examining gardens as resilient spaces, perceptions of evacuation sites, that's nearby safer places, smoke health planning, and shared responsibility in fire management. Drawing on her upbringing in rural Norway and extensive international fieldwork, Anna combines rigorous social research with creative participatory methods to understand and strengthen the community's preparedness for bushfires. Now, Philippa McCormick, she is an associate professor at the Australian Research Council, she has an Australian Research Council DECRA fellow at the Adelaide Law School, Adelaide University. She is also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Tasmania Law School. Her DECRA project is about designing future fire laws as the climate changes. More broadly, her research focuses on law and governance for climate adaptation, biodiversity, and natural resource management, and extreme events such as bushfires. Phil is a past early career researcher fellow with Natural Hazards Research Australia. She's affiliated with the Wildlife Crime Research Hub at Adelaide University and a chief investigator on an ARC discovery project about laws and policies for climate adapted restoration on private land. So we're super lucky to have both Anna and Phil here with us today. I will get people to hold your questions and pop them in the Q&A, so we can talk about their wonderful research as we go. Anna and Phil will also have some questions as we go. There'll also be a survey that I'll pop in that people can fill in about the work so we can see how it's useful, usable, and used for the wider society out there. So I'd like to now hand over to Anna and Phil to give our wonderful presentation to everybody.
Thank you so much. I'll just pop up my PowerPoint slide. First, I just want to start off by saying thank you so much for coming to this knowledge sharing forum today, where we're talking about shared responsibility and bushfire management. I also want to extend gratitude to people that have participated in this study. We've gotten 64 individuals across community and organization and government to give their feedback so that we can learn from diverse perspectives on shared responsibility and bushfire management. And we will be sharing preliminary insights from these insights today. As Ro introduced me about what I've been working on in Tasmania, I also want to talk a little bit about my previous PhD in Norway, because I've been in the field of wildfires and social sciences for 6 years. And in Norway, I was working with local communities to understand mitigation opportunities in and around the asset protection zone and there. I also want to acknowledge the very good team I have around me when it comes to creating this research. So giving thanks to David Bowman and Owen Price, that's part of the team. And now I'm handing it over to Philippa, that will introduce herself.
I don't need to introduce myself again. Thank you, Anna. It's really important that we acknowledge we're working with some cracking people. And thank you so much for the warm introduction, though, Ro. That was really wonderful. And if you could go to the next slide, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we are both speaking from the land of the Muanina people, Nipaluna, Hobart, and it's such a huge privilege to be working on this land. And I think it's really particularly important in the context of a concept like shared responsibility to acknowledge the fact that responsibility hasn't been shared. Traditional knowledge and traditional ecological and cultural fire knowledge hasn't been honoured. And we're in a period of change, but there's a lot of work to do to better acknowledge and honour and share that responsibility. So as we acknowledge country, also acknowledge the work to be done and the honour that it is to do it. So we'll flick to the next slide, Anna, and put this work in context for the bigger project that you were a part of.
Yeah, so we want to acknowledge that this project is part of a much bigger project together with the Natural Hazard Research Australia. And if you're interested in more of the work that the Fire Centre is doing, we will provide a link later on, but you can also find a link down to the left here on this slide. And today's presentation, we've divided into 3 parts. First, we will tell you a little bit about the context around shared responsibility. Then we will present our project. And then at the end, we would reflect a little bit around the next steps for shared responsibility. And we prepared some questions for the audience as well to get some feedback from lessons learned across Australia.
So this is an introductory kind of context setting task. As an academic, it's very important that we give you the kind of backdrop to the research we're doing, but we definitely do not need to labour this point with this audience. Wildfire is a global phenomenon, and changes in wildfire have been observed in the real world and also in the literature for many years. The global wildfire context is a really has been the subject of a lot of literature in the last few years in particular. I just wanted to highlight on this slide a few of the trends that have been observed, particularly in Australia. So the increase in dangerous fire weather, lengthening fire seasons, the decrease between fire seasons, the increase in burned area, the increase in the frequency of megafires, and the extension of the fire season into spring and autumn. These are really, really important contextual features because the concept of shared responsibility has always been one that's been on the table. We have always been thinking about who does what and whose responsibility particular tasks are. But as the global fire context and the Australian fire context changes, the concept of shared responsibility becomes even more important and even more challenging. And so on the next slide, we highlight the fact that wildfire is a wicked problem. And this is probably academic speak, but the guts of what it means is just that when you try to fix it, sometimes you create more problems. Every aspect of the problem can have its own drivers and its own kind of effects. And actually how we understand the problem changes depending on who we are and our capability and our experiences. So different people around Australia see the wildfire problem as a different kind of problem. And there are, it shouldn't be surprising then that this question of shared responsibility and what that looks like is also really challenging to define and to understand.
Thank you. So before we dip into the concept of shared responsibility itself, we want to talk a little bit about the recent research on the complexity and the scope of new opportunities for wildfire mitigation. And Australia is a leader on that side. For adaptation, Australian citizens has a lot of autonomy in decision about responses to threatening fire, such as leave early and stay and defend. For residents, this also includes preventative efforts such as garden adaptation and structural adjustment to their houses. For fuel management, we're often thinking about large-scale landowners and public land, such as Crown land, but residents and businesses can also prepare their asset protection zones involving the garden and the structural adjustment. For prevention and preparedness, with landowners, the fire service, parks and wildlife and forestry all play a part. And for homes and properties, creating a buffer zone around the houses can save it during a fire episode. And this can also have positive effect for the overall community.
It is my absolute joy to talk to you about the governance of shared responsibility. But again, I'm not going to labour this point. On the next slide, I've just put together a kind of a figure that hints at how we talk about shared responsibility across scales. And of course, it finds its expression at the top of our pyramid in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and in national strategies and frameworks and plans, and at the downscaled level at state and local and regional and municipal scales in these emergency management arrangements, which every state and territory has. This is so simplistic. I know that those of you who work in this space will look at that and be like, you have no idea the complexity of this framework and how this concept of shared responsibility plays out in the real world. I do have some idea, and a little bit of the work that I've been doing is referenced there at the bottom. And my particular area of expertise is in actually what are usually indirect influences on the task of sharing, on whose job it is to do particular activities to prepare for wildfire seasons. And what we find is that most of those laws, most of those statutory instruments, they don't specifically talk about shared responsibility at all, but they give power to particular people and they constrain activities by particular people. What I mean by that is you have, for example, the Social Security Act allowing somebody to access funding to respond and recover, from an extreme event like a wildfire, which has implications for how they get ready for the next one. The EPBC Act, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, as amended in 2025. It's a piece of legislation about protecting nature, and it stops you, for example, from clearing critical habitat that's listed under that act, or Ramsar wetlands and World Heritage areas and those kinds of things, listed threatened species. So there are these indirect but extremely important laws which give power and which constrain activities that are really, really important in the way that we think about the governance framework and the concept of shared responsibility. For the purposes of our talk today, it's really important to understand that most of these instruments and frameworks talk about the need to share. They talk about the fact of shared responsibility, if they mention it at all, but they also allocate authority to act to governments. So to the national government, to regional bodies sometimes, and to state governments. They also give particular authority or particular decision-making arrangements to individuals. So you can do certain things on your own land because you own that land. You can act in particular ways. But for the most part, they're pretty much silent on what the job is for the bit in the middle. So in between state governments and individual landholders, there's a host of complex collectives, groups and organisations and businesses who do things all the time. And the law actually doesn't have anywhere near as much to say about how they work in this space, about what their role is, about what they can do and what they can't do, and about what we might expect of them. So that's a really interesting grey area in the law, and that creates heaps of opportunity for innovation and experimentation, or lagging, shortfalls, uncoordination, gaps, overlaps, and chaos. So there's a space in the middle there that we're really interested in this research. Just really briefly, noting the time, and I just really briefly on the next slide want to mention the fact that even within those national documents, we do see a shift in the way that they talk about, for example, community groups, some of those in-between groups, grassroots organisations and so on. And it shifts from, back in 2011, there was a real emphasis on community responsibility and the role that communities play. And that changed quite a bit in the 2018 disaster risk reduction framework. And there's been a gradual kind of shifting back. And we haven't included the 2025 National Adaptation Plan in there but that will be something that we look at a little bit more in our research. But we'll go now to our actual project and tell you some of the things that we've been finding.
So then we'll talk a little bit about our project. And two of the leading questions is what does government, NGOs, community organizations, or group think shared responsibility means? And do they perceive responsibility being shared? If so, how? And if not, why? And this is important because we think that maybe scholars has an idea about how this ought to be, and governments might have an idea about how it looks like, but the community groups and boundary spanning organizations, we're not sure if they have the same certainty about the concept or if they define it in the same way. And does it matter? Are they confident? Where are the gaps? And answering these kind of questions can help us inform law, inform budgets, and also highlight mismatches, which we can further look into, so to overcome barriers. So this study began with a comprehensive literature review, and we've also done a lot of surveys involving top-down, bridging, grassroots organizations, and a few business groups, and some interviews also to develop deeper insights. And we wish to continue digging into interviews in the future to get an even deeper understanding. And our starting point for the research project was to look at the local and the Tasmanian groups. But then as we went on, we extended the focus to gain insight from other states in Australia and also other scales. So we included government or top-down agencies and organizations. And all of this led to quite an extensive body of data, and we wish to share some of the preliminary insights from the study. When we looked into the literature, we looked into, like, in particular, shared responsibility for bushfire management, and we found that in this body of work, there was not that much focus on groups where individuals organize themselves, but the more typical viewpoint is from like individual householders or landowners till central authority and framework and mechanisms that they hold. And we added a point to this diagram on the left, the community-led. So to understand how local community organize themselves to take on responsibility. And please remember this continuum because I'll refer to it a little bit later with the findings. I also want to acknowledge that Blythe McLennan has done like comprehensive work when it comes to shared responsibility, and she also was pointing to the community-led as a good next step for the shared responsibility framework. And we have some anecdotal evidence showing that many local groups and organizations have an understanding of the risk in their local vicinity, and they also have an interest in undertaking fuel management activities and safekeep ecological values and their local communities. And the purpose of the study is really to understand different perspectives of shared responsibility within the doctrine that underpins Australian disaster risk management. And keep in mind, it's a qualitative study, so we're looking into the nuances and the deep meanings of shared responsibility. We want to investigate the literature gap that we've highlighted, and also for practical implications, inform and support community wildfire adaptation. We've focused on 3 groups in particular: the top-down organizations and institutions, the bridging institutions, and community groups. We also have a small sample of businesses, and the householders or people at the individual level are indirectly represented. I'll let you know a little bit more about what we mean by bridging organizations and community groups. So they are both at the meso level of societal organization, but bridging organization, we define them as like more connectors and supporters, and they're generally more focused on an issue rather than only just a place. While community groups often work locally, are volunteer-based, and they have some vision for either environmental positive impact or social positive impact in their local community. And here are some top-down initiatives where communities are targeted to take part of the shared responsibility for bushfire management. One example is the Tasmanian Fire Service that works with local residents and with wildfire preparedness and educating people about emergency options, and also how to prepare your property for a potential bushfire. While Red Hot Tips supports and inform large-scale landowners. And then you also have collaboration between fire agencies, forestry, and parks and wildlife working together to reduce fuel loads. And there is also lots of other initiatives with councils and other government organizations that work in the space. And we've been very lucky to have a broad range of people participating in the study. To mention a few, we have the council government, we have fire and emergency, we have local neighborhood groups, land care groups, and traditional owners and continuing custodians of Palava country, to mention a few. If you look at the top down organization represented, we have quite a lot of the fire and emergency personnel, and in the bridging institutions, we've lucky to have a lot of people from wildfire and emergency specific groups. And then in the grassroots organizations, there's been a lot of interest from local land care groups. And now I'll look a little bit into the survey results. A lot of the participants agree that shared responsibility is indeed very important. And people think that everyone shares responsibility. But then people talk about this shared responsibility in quite varied ways. Some people talk more about holistic management, talking about landscape-wide, community-wide, or they can talk more about tenure-specific, like where some people have more ownership than others and agency to make changes. They also can talk from an official point of view or a civic point of view, more talking about community and residents. We found that over 50% of this group thinks that shared responsibility works reasonably well or very well. But there might be a paradox there with like different operational understanding and experiences, depending on which of the groups they belong to. So we found that shared responsibility in some way is a bit institutionalized, where we can recognize some of the patterns that we had in the diagram, from like self-sufficiency to central authorities. And this was a theme that was consistent throughout all of the different groups, but more in the top-down organizations. While bridging institutions were talking often about community empowerment and intentional sharing of power and influence. And then also grassroots organizations were sharing from lived experiences. They were talking about experiences where resources had been pulled back, which limited them in taking part of their responsibility. We also found that a lot of the grassroots organizations were talking about a holistic approach to share responsibility. And a quote from a traditional owner and continuing custodian of Palava country highlight this. It is the role of all landowners and managers to contribute to safer and more ecologically sound practices that reduce risk and minimize impact to communities and the environment we live in. We also asked what is the most important aspect of shared responsibility in an ideal world. And a lot of people talked about working together. well, also a trend amongst top-down and grassroots organization were clear roles. And then among bridging organization, they were talking about the community empowerment. And one quote that can highlight a little bit about what community empowerment might entail is this one. I'm going to read it out to you. Empowerment means actually having some genuine participation in decision making, because otherwise, to not have that, we are disempowered and we aren't able to protect ourselves or our environment if there are these decisions made and we don't get to participate in them. Another person that works as a local champion in rural Victoria and previously had experience as a fire and emergency officer highlighted, community empowerment is a strange thing. I used to think it was my job, but it wasn't, because empowerment suggests that someone has the power to empower people. So empowerment actually has the wrong context. Enabling is a better word. And now I want to highlight some of the cases we've come across where community groups have tried to take their part in shared responsibility for bushfire management, and some have had some more success than others. So there's 4 of these cases. So there was one where Landscape Care Group undertook weed management on public land to support natural values. And they collaborated with a local research team to undertake activities that reduces fuel load. And unfortunately, they encountered showstoppers and were prohibited from undertaking those mitigation activities. Case 2, a household-oriented local wildfire preparedness initiative. So this group collaborated with the fire service to facilitate information meeting in local community. This created some momentum for wildfire preparedness. But then the fire service changed their priority, and next time the fire service tells them, we're not really doing that anymore. The group finds it hard to motivate local community without the fire service support. Case 3, a local wildfire mitigation initiative. A group collaborates with a local council and volunteer firefighter to apply for a fuel reduction equipment grant. They receive the funding, but while waiting for the equipment, a wildfire affects the local community and burns down close to 20 houses. Case 4, a land care group buys their own land to take care of natural amenities. They collaborate with other local land care groups for fuel reduction and a traditional owner and continuing custodian of Palava country, and learns how to use low-intensity fire. They create a strategic fire plan to mitigate fire risk in their local community and undertakes fuel reduction activities that adheres to conservation principles. So another incident in Tasmania highlights how a community wishes to participate to a bigger degree. So after the 2025 dolphin fire, dolphin sands fire, that damaged close to 30 homes and over 200 assets, a community member shared her thoughts with the Hubbard Mercury. Shared responsibility must go beyond individual community members participating. No, sorry, I need to say that again. Shared responsibility must go beyond individual community members preparing their properties for bushfires. Our lives are on the line. We literally have skin in the game, and we have a lot to offer. Bureaucratic indifference must end. And a couple of things that they vision is that they should have the right to defend properly prepared homes, if willing and able, and maintain fire breaks and road verge and compliance monitoring with bushfire hazard management plans. They want a year-round fire ban in dolphin sands and alternatives to burning. They want free green waste disposal for residents and genuine collaboration with relevant authorities. They want coastal reserve vegetation management and a feasibility study into escape routes.
So one of the things that we were really interested to have in our mind as we went through the process of collecting this information and these insights from particularly these bridging organisations and these grassroots communities, but also as we progress the research forwards. If you can just go to the next slide for me, please, Anna. Was what could we do to actually change things when every individual community might have some things that are really unique to them, and we're looking across the whole country. Obviously, that's an absolutely enormous task. But we're presented with this really interesting opportunity in Tassie. So for our research pathway and the next steps for the research pathway, it is, as you might expect, we're going to pull together a great report for NHRA. You all have to read it. It's going to be fantastic. We're going to tell you what we found in great detail and argue that through in a really logical way. There's some ongoing qualitative analysis. Some of you on this call may have been part of the interviews and surveys that we've done. And as Anna said, we're super grateful for that. And we're going to continue some interviews to build out our analysis. But in terms of an impact pathway, and I have spoken about this before, so I apologise if you've heard me talk about it, but the Tasmanian government is in the process of writing a brand new piece of legislation, and it's a fascinating opportunity because at the back of my mind, whenever I'm doing almost anything, I'm wondering if we were to start from scratch on this issue, what might that look like? Do you know? Like if you as a person working in Victoria or New South Wales or Western Australia, you know, the big states with lots of law, and you're working with these frameworks that are complex with lots of layers, and you could just start from scratch, what would you put in there? You know, what would the provisions look like to capture this idea of shared responsibility where there are jobs for the government, really clear and important roles that the government needs to play. There are, you know, opportunities for landholders to step up and manage risks on their property, but there's this really important middle layer of passionate, enthusiastic, energetic people who kind of crystallize support amongst a broader group of people to walk that fine line between, for example, community cohesion and risk reduction, or environmental management and risk reduction, or building sort of community infrastructure and risk management. Where do we talk about and give authority and opportunities to those groups from a legal perspective? It's a fascinating question and I'm grappling with it. I'd love to hear what you think. But as we continue to work through the insights from this project, we'll be wondering about that and writing about that and thinking about that. And there are also, from Anna's perspective and her extraordinary experience with community, bottom-up and community-driven research, there's opportunities to build on the Sparking Conversations project, which you're very welcome to look up or ask Anna about later. But it's bringing people together to have conversations that aren't normal conversations about what risk looks like and what they might do about it together. So that's where we're going next. But this, of course, is a presentation that invites you to reflect on what you've heard, to think about what we're learning and to help us learn together. And so we're really grateful that you came along. And to those of you listening back to the recording, thank you. Please do reach out. But I think, Anna, now if you go to the next slide and then very quickly on to the slide after that. Thank you all. And then we have a few questions that we are interested to put to you. Examples of times when you've seen shared responsibility really work, or particular barriers or challenges for community groups taking up responsibility that you've seen that you'd be willing to share with us. And of course, any questions that you have for us about the research, we'd love to hear from you. That's the end of our presentation. Thanks, Ro.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So much information and so much for everybody to chat about. But if anyone does have any questions to ask, you can pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. Either way, I can work with that one. Or comments on the two questions that Anna and Phil just put up. We'd love to hear your views. Meanwhile, I definitely have some for you. So Anna, I love Norway. It was a turning point in my life, actually, sitting on a rock in Norway, looking out over the fjords and the bush, and well, bush, we call it forest over there. And it was like just a turning point for me of going into the environmental field, definitely. And life's all about rocks. But for me, the question for you, considering you come from Norway and have worked on a wildfire risk reduction in a Norwegian context, are there any cases of shared responsibility in Norway that we can learn from here in Australia?
Thank you so much, Rowan. Interesting to hear about your time in Norway as well.
Gorgeous place.
Yeah. So I did my PhD back in Norway, where we looked at different mitigation activities on the Norwegian coastal west coast, in particular in like one ecosystem mainly in Kaluna-dominated heathlands, which is more shrubland. And in my local community where I was researching, there was one group. They are a civic burner group, but you could directly translate them into Haugalandet, which is like the name of the local area, and Heatland Burner Group. So they are a group of farmers that comes together, organizes themselves, and support each other in doing fuel reduction burns. That also supports ecological values and husbandry. So like producing of like local food in the area. And this was a practice that they did in that area for 6,000 years. But due to industrialization and the finding of oil and the modernization of Norway, this practice was like forgotten after some time almost, and making the settlements in Norway more and more exposed to fire threat. So having those groups have really helped us, like putting that back on the agenda, and they've also been able to help fire brigades fighting uncontrollable fires. And yeah, it's been a very interesting learning point in Norway. Maybe there's something to learn in Australia from that as well.
Oh, definitely. It's not one we think a lot about Norway with fires, but yeah, it's occurring around the world now.
Yeah.
Different story now. So no, thanks for sharing that, Anna. I just have a question for Phil, and then I'll get on to the chat questions. And that is, considering your background in law, Phil, can you speak to how regulations and policies can support and constrain communities wanting to take on responsibility for bushfire risk management?
Very briefly, because actually this is like a lifetime's work. I have a 25-year plan for my research, and it's all like about what the law does and doesn't do well. But look, one of the things that we know is that a lot of the legal frameworks that are really important, a lot of the rules about how we engage with land and fire and risk are not about fire or risk. So, for example, the rules that govern how we deal with native vegetation are trying to achieve all kinds of different values. So some of them are about, forestry, private forestry, public forestry. Some of them are about weeds and weed management. Some of them are about biodiversity protection and habitat protection, looking after nature around our properties and around our landscapes. If we were to prioritise fire risk over everything, and in some places arguably we do, all of those other values get put into the background, and we say, to minimize the risk in this context, this is the best thing to do. Most of the time, that's really, really problematic. I mean, if clearing all of the landscape is the best way to reduce the risk, what you're going to see is an enormous proportion of people furious about that, because we live in places that we love. So what the law is always trying to do is find the balance, or sorry, no, not what the law is trying to do. What people who implement law are trying to do is balance the different values that need to be protected, the different priorities for different groups of people, and how we do that. One of the things that we see as wildfire regimes change, as bushfire regimes change, is the very high likelihood that those values get balanced differently. What I would really love to see is a better connection between the laws about how we look after native vegetation and protect some native vegetation and get rid of other native vegetation, connected more explicitly to the ways that we think about our obligations in emergency management frameworks. It's not to suggest that fire agencies don't think about it. Of course, they always do. But to connect up the stories that we tell about looking after landscapes and looking after people in the context of fire, and also reconnecting people with fire as a tool, as an expression of landscape management, as an opportunity to connect with place, and also, and most importantly, of course, as a cultural responsibility for those that hold that responsibility. So the opportunity is there for the law to do all kinds of things differently. It's just writing, law is made by people. We've got all kinds of opportunities to fix it and do it differently. But I think, and it's come up in all kinds of conversations lately, so much of what the law is all about is stories. It's about how we understand ourselves in places, how we relate to each other, how we relate to land. And if we were to tell more complex stories, and if we were to connect in with stories, I think we would probably do law a bit differently. Big driver for how I come at law reform in my work.
Which Mel's got a question that kind of ties into that at the moment. She's asked, where do you think personal relationships sit in all this operationalising shared responsibility?
Mel, thank you for this question, because I said that I wanted to answer it live, and that's because it's so easy to forget that the vast majority of how things really happen in the real world aren't the result of a rule that's written down that you have to put into place. Actually, they're about people identifying problems, trying to fix them, working within the constraints of their role with the people that they work best with, or, grappling with relationships that are hard. And what we see in so many contexts, and in conservation work that I've done and ecological restoration work that I've done, champions within an organization who are like, I'm going to see this done better, change the world in the way that law reform doesn't, rarely does. So the relationships question, absolutely critical, so important, really hard to articulate in a set of rules or a policy or a strategy. You can't say all these kinds of people have to be friends. So there is an element of chaos to it, like the luck and happenstance. But when you find yourself in that situation, it's good.
Great. Now, Beck, you've got your hand up.
Thanks a million. Just in relation to those two conversation points that you have on the screen, I'm going to talk to point 2 to circle back to point 1. So I'm in local government, and the management of fire in reserves falls to my remit. Now, we had quite a few friends of groups undertaking work in our reserves, often in quite an unregulated way, as in they were just people that backed onto the reserves and decided to meet up and undertake stuff in public lands, some of whom had self-insured, some of which had no insurance and were happily working in these spaces. And of course, liability is one of those considerations that local government has to have. And in the last couple of months, I've been working with an organisation called Tamar NRM up here to form an umbrella network called the Cunnamalooka Network to take all of these groups under a broader wing, under their insurance, and then to structure the activities that they're doing in that space. And one of the primary focus often for a lot of these groups is weed management in their space. But since we've sort of ratified this process, we have incorporated fire management practices in a few of the reserves where it is appropriate. So activities such as thinning the she oak forests that are popping up everywhere, but also getting those community groups to help form well-structured piles that can be burnt, and then potentially moving some of the fuels out of the reserves into an accessible location where our arboriculture crews can then actually remove them. So our focus historically has been on doing prescribed burns sort of at quite extended periods of time and then allowing fuel loads to burn up. But we're now sort of pivoting to a model that's looking at fuel management as not something that we do every 10, 15 years, but as something that we're doing annually in our reserves in conjunction with staff and these really passionate volunteer groups. One of the gaps that I see, I suppose, is the knowledge that the volunteer groups have. For instance, I met on site a couple of weeks ago and they were outraged at the width of the fuel modified buffer zone that we popped in there. And it took a bit of education to say, yep, this FMBZ is on an uphill slope. And so in some areas, you're absolutely right, our fuel modified buffer zones are quite small. But in this instance, we had to take into account the topography of the site and that fire break had to be a bit bigger. So public education, really important, I suppose, part of this conversation, because we do have community groups that want to be actively involved in their reserves and they do what they think is best, but certainly I see that there's scope for a bit more public education in that area. I hope that is of some value.
Thank you so much, Beck. I love that example so much, partly because the education took place in the context of the actual setting with the people that it most affected in the real world. Like that's location specific, time relevant education through the direct relationship that you have with that community. It's a really wonderful example and appreciate you sharing it.
Cool. Thanks, Beck. Now I've got one from Deb Stanley as well, and I've taken you so you can speak too if you want, Deb. But it was she's asked, observing challenges in the ACT for empowering community groups to take responsibility. Sometimes this has limited implementation of burning due to increased engagement with unreconcilable disagreements about ecological outcomes. Using the diverse research base with different parties, decided different outcomes are the best way forward. Have you seen this elsewhere?
Wasn't very eloquently written. It was just a thought bubble, but yeah, just there's been some great scenarios in the burning space of working with different community groups where we create great outcomes and great shared objectives together as an agency, and then working with those groups. But then in other contexts where community groups are not interested in the full breadth of research and the position of the agency, sometimes that leads to implementation not even occurring. Just seeing this as a trend around the country and wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I'm not completely sure about it. I know that is it in the context of research on the best practice for ecological value?
Yeah, just in burning research and what the best outcome for risk reduction is, whether burning is a suitable way to reduce risk long term.
So it would be really nice to have that conversation with David Bowman and Owen Price, that has much more extensive background in fire ecology than me. They're doing some research on a university reserve now as well, like looking at different management practices, but not necessarily with burning. But please get in touch, and it would be nice to have a chat.
Yeah, there's a question a lot of people are asking, Deb, so we hear you on that one. The next question we've got is Paul John Walker, and he's asked, how might we overcome the apparent indifference from some of these intermediary authorities? We have a live situation in our local council putting a fuel reduction project in the too hard basket, having initially committed to partner in it. And there's a bit more chat from Robin Moore about this topic as well. So it's about, hazard reduction burns becoming too hard because there's so much going on and the social buy-in.
Yeah, we at least did a paper in Tasmania about the public perceptions on fuel reduction, and that there was appetite from the Tasmanian population for fuel reduction, but also in collaboration between different actors and having more low intensity burning, for example, as part of it. It depended a little bit on also political orientation and how people would perceive and welcome that. Not sure if I answered the question.
It's all right. Paul, if you want to comment anything, you're welcome to.
No, we just, Robin has raised this as well. We just have a situation where a lot of effort was gone to obtain a chipper mulcher to be used out here in Dolphin Sands for fuel reduction in partnership with the council matching funding. Now that the chipper has been delivered, they are now saying, no, we don't want to do it. It's a live situation that we're under discussion, but I think we're just looking for how we might sensibly be able to get some forward action on this. I don't know if Robin might want to say something about it, since she's also raised it.
Cool, Rob, I've given you the chance. You do want to talk about it?
Oh yeah, look, I can't really say much more than what Paul's saying. I guess I was responding to the question about barriers and challenges for community groups. So we have a very engaged community group in Dolphin Sands, and we're doing what we can, and we just keep bumping up against hurdles and indifference from various authorities, and we find this incredibly frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating to feel powerless, like we're doing whatever we can at our level, but in terms of shared responsibility, how can we share responsibility when we're just treated in very sort of just condescending ways from various agencies, and we're not respected as knowledgeable or key stakeholders in the process. So really the only responsibility that we're sort of allowed is to maintain our own patch. It doesn't go any higher than that. So that's kind of our frustration.
I think it's important to raise these kind of issues because it's a slow process, and making changes in these very like systematic bureaucratic systems, and having this conversation is a very important step. And also the community showing that they want to share the responsibilities, applying for grants, getting a mulcher and everything like that. It's a very important step in the entire system of bushfire management.
Thank you. Now, this one's got 3 likes. So, Stephen Martin, you've asked, are there funding models better than others for shared responsibility in fire risk management? I think Phil was typing an answer. Did you have something to say on that one?
I was about to say, Stephen, that's such an important question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Which is fine. You can raise that answer, and it's too hard. But yeah, Stephen, please speak up.
Well, go, Stephen.
I was just going to elaborate that I'm a member at PowerLink Queensland that I work for is a member of the Queensland Fire and Biodiversity Consortium, and it's been going for many years, but it's fair to say, like any community-led organisation, goes through its struggles for funding, and just if there are more sustainable models out there, I'm all ears to pass it on to my colleagues.
Such an important question. I think so. What I was going to say was two things. The first is the government sort of funding cycle, election to election, is not probably one of the best funding models for engaging community. And that's not to suggest that community isn't being engaged and connected with by all fire agencies. I certainly don't want to make that point at all. But that's hard, when the priorities change after an election. The consortium model where funding comes in for particular projects, and there's some kind of ongoing funding for the functions of the consortium, is probably better than that, but faces the same kind of funding cycle barrier. While I was typing, I was thinking, I wonder if something like the trust model. So you see in conservation covenants, so on private land, areas of land set aside and managed for particular purposes, governed or funded under a trust model where it's sort of arm's length from government. It's got its own kind of specific set of responsibilities, and the funding is maintained and sustained over the long term. Maybe there's an opportunity to do something like that in this space. And I'm not aware of examples of that, but that doesn't mean they're not happening. There's so many different sort of features of this research and practice space that it might be happening. But It seems to me like some kind of model that allows you to put in money at the outset with some kind of I don't know, like a return on interest and so on, like an investment model, might be a better way to think about this, because we need sustained, long-term, consistent, predictable funding sources to build relationships with community that can be that can grow over time and really answer some of these other questions that folks are asking, to help us to share purposes, to help us to understand the complexity, and to help us sometimes accept trade-offs when we're trying to protect all kinds of values. Not all of them will be protected in every scenario.
Thank you for that one, Phil.
Thank you.
Now, I know we've got 2 minutes to go. So what I want to make sure is that we thank all our speakers and everyone who has joined us online today, pop stuff into the chat, question and answers, come to listen and ask questions. Keep asking the questions, email them through, fill in our survey form. We'd love to hear more from everyone. I'd like you to know that NHRA have plenty more events coming up online and in person. And the next one is the fire case studies. That's on the 31st of March. We'd love to have you along to that one. There's also the Natural Hazard Research Forum, the 10th to the 12th of June, and that information you'll find on our website, and we hope to see many of you there. And if you haven't already signed up to our newsletter, please do sign up to our newsletter. It'll let you know everything that's going on at NHRA and how to follow us in social media. I'd like to thank you for coming along and look forward to seeing you next time. Big thank you to Philippa and Anna. Cheers, everybody.